If you have a stable job and earn an income, what would you want next? A trip abroad to treat yourself? A comfortable retirement nest egg? Or get married, have children, buy a house, and build a future? For millions of people in the UK right now, that question sounds a bit because their only wish is simply to be able to get through dinner today and live another day.
It's mad that you should have to. You're working in a good job, you'd think you'd be able to afford everything and going on holidays and everything like that, but in the reality, they're struggling to even put food on the table.
What's clear is that people feel politically abandoned to their financial woes.
This is not an emotional lament. This is the new normal for a country once considered a symbol of stability and prosperity. When income grows slower than rent, when energy bills turn winter into a nightmare, when public healthcare becomes an endless queue, the concept of life is no longer about living to move forward, but about living to avoid falling behind. So, what's making Britain harder to live in year after year, slowly enough for people to endure, but steadily enough for people to burn out? The answer lies in the smallest of details. The everyday frictions, the things that reveal the whole picture behind them. People used to see Britain as a place that worked. It's not paradise, but it's the kind of country where you can live by habit. Going to the supermarket doesn't need to be stressful. Turning on the heater is a no-brainer. And if there's a problem, at least you still believe the system will respond to you in some way. But lately, that feeling seems to have disappeared. It started with a general feeling that nothing works smoothly anymore, public services were strained, and economic pressure weighed on every daily decision. And what's remarkable is that it's no longer an isolated lament. A survey conducted at the end of 2025 revealed that 77% of Britons believe their country is broken, with over a third considering it completely broken. Only about 1/5 feel that things are still running well. When such a large number appears, the question is no longer who is right and who is wrong, but rather, what in daily life makes people feel as if they are being pushed away bit by bit? The answer likely lies in the most basic things being put on the chopping block. A decent dinner? A warm enough living room? A trip to the supermarket without having to calculate like the chief accountant of your own life? You don't need to read the business newspaper to realize that. Just look at the shopping cart. With the same shopping list, the total amount always seems to know how to inflate itself. You wonder, what else did I buy? No, you're just paying extra. The tax of the times. Rising food prices are not only causing confusion, it creates a form of mental friction. Each time you choose a dish is a negotiation with yourself. Trim the meat. Fresh vegetables are gradually decreasing. Cheap and starchy foods are gaining popularity. The meal is no longer optimal for health, the optimal meal for the bill. But if food is where you see life getting more expensive by the penny, then energy is where you see life getting more expensive by the degree of warmth. Britain has weathered the shock. The heating switch, from an unconscious act, has become a financial decision. The energy regulator previously raised the price cap for electricity and gas by 54% last month. One jump was enough to turn the phrase "going home to warm up" into a thought of not wanting to go home to face the electricity bill. Ironically, this country can accurately calculate interest rates, exchange rates, and even the emissions of a flight. But it forces millions of people to calculate whether they can afford to turn on the heating. What was once a basic amenity is now treated as a small luxury, the kind of luxury you have to fight yourself for every night. And as food and energy prices rose, the people's reaction became very straightforward. Cut. A November 2025 survey found that 61% of adults said the cost of living had increased compared to the previous month. Almost all mentioned rising food prices, and 68% pointed to higher gas/electricity bills. Even more concerning is that the cuts didn't stop at non-essential. 39% cut essential spending like food, and 36% reduced energy consumption at home. Some people will say, inflation has cooled down. That's right, but cooling down doesn't mean life gets cheaper. It just means you're climbing the hill slower. Not that you're going downhill. The number 11.1% once sounded like something from a TV news report. but its impact is right in the kitchen and in the bedroom. The paradox is, the poor often pay more for energy in a real sense because they live in energy-inefficient homes. National Energy Action once estimated that households experiencing fuel poverty have to pay an average of about £417 more per year compared to if they lived in more energy-efficient homes. Poverty is therefore no longer a personal tragedy. It became an invisible tax, hitting the most vulnerable group with the least ability to resist. So why do basic necessities, food and warmth, become something people have to negotiate every day? And what do you find more tiring, rising food prices, or the feeling that the heating switch is turning into a test of courage? There was an old promise that Britain used to live by. If you worked hard, you would have a decent life. That promise is not a political slogan. It's an unspoken agreement between the people and society. You contribute, and society gives you back a minimum dignified standard of living. The problem is that in recent years, that agreement seems to have been amended in small print, and no one is sending updates to the people. You still see people going to work. The train station is still crowded. There are still people queuing at the cafes. On the surface, the economy looks like it's doing very well. But if you look at real conversations in families, in bars, in workers' break rooms, you'll hear a repeated phrase. I work enough hours. Why is it still missing? This is when working but poor steps out of the realm of reports and directly impacts the lives of the people. Inflation has widened the gap between wages and the cost of living like a long crack. Salary can increase according to the contract, but the cost of living increases in real life. People don't live in charts, they live on credit. A bill that is one day late is subject to a fee. A meal with one less dish is healthy. Once my child gets sick, the entire week's finances are thrown off balance. At that time, having a job only meant you were qualified to keep working, let alone being able to live decently. The consequence is that life becomes a series of defensive decisions. You work extra to pay the electricity bill. Then you lose time taking care of your children. Then you get exhausted. Then you work less efficiently. And then you have to work extra again. A loop that looks like a personal choice is actually a social mechanism. The system pushes risk down to each individual, then is surprised when they break. As a society has more and more people who are tolerated rather than lived with, support networks begin to change roles. Food banks, community shops, relief supplies, which were supposed to be emergency lifelines, are now gradually resembling a parallel infrastructure. It exists not because people suddenly became less diligent, but because the old formula going to work is enough no longer fits. In 5 years, the number of emergency food support packages distributed reached over 3 million. That number doesn't just speak to hunger. It's about a standard of living that's being eroded to the point where it has to be supported by community relief. People still hear speeches about motivation, productivity, and self-reliance. But in real life, self-reliance is measured by how long you can endure before having to resort to a packet of noodles and a can of beans. Perhaps this is the modern version of the English dream. You don't need to be rich, you just need to be strong enough to survive until the next payday. So, what's the real question? Are the people demanding too much, or are they just asking for something very small, after working all week, to be able to eat a decent meal in the evening and sleep in a room that's warm enough? And if going to work is no longer a ticket to stability, what will be the first thing put up as collateral each month? It's usually not the car, it's not the phone, but it's about housing a bill that gathers all worries into a single due number. The housing crisis is no longer a simple concept of not having a place to live, and it's also gradually becoming a total bill. A figure stands at the door of the house every month like a toll collector. That's why housing isn't just expensive. It became something that gathered all other pressures into a very simple command: pay or leave. What's remarkable is that this isn't a one-year crisis. It's like a construction debt that has accumulated over decades. It is estimated that the UK is short about 4. 3 million homes compared to what an average European country might have built. It sounds like a macro-level figure, but its impact is very everyday. When supply is short, competition increases. When competition increases, prices rise. And when prices rise, the quality of life is squeezed. And when something as basic as housing is lacking on a large scale, society begins to function like a queue without an order board. Renting a house is even more like an anchor. Private rental prices increased by approximately 6.2% in the 12 months leading up to December 2023, a rise that caused many people not only to tighten their spending, but also to tighten their future prospects. Because raising rent isn't just about increasing money, it increases instability. You don't know what the next extension period will be like. You don't know how long you'll be in that area. You start living with a temporary feeling, even though the contract states 12 months. If renting is an anchor, then taking out a mortgage is a test of endurance against interest rates. There was a period when people borrowed with a fixed term that seemed safe, but a few years later, looking back, they discovered that this safety was just a flat stretch before the downhill slope. There are forecasts indicating that approximately 3.9 million households will need to refinance their interest rates before the end of 2025, meaning a significant number of families will experience a monthly recalculation right when the cost of living remains high. And it's estimated that around 320,000 people could be pushed into relative poverty just because of rising interest rates. If income is calculated after housing costs, it's a very special kind of poverty. You're not unemployed, you're not idle, you're not living wrong. You just happen to be alive at the time. Interest rates reversed. Housing isn't just about money. It takes planning ability. When most of your income is sucked into a non-negotiable bill, all other options shrink. You don't dare change jobs because you're afraid your first month's salary will be out of sync. You don't dare take sick leave for fear of losing your bonus. You don't dare have children because the combined cost of childcare and rent sounds like an unfunny joke. Such a society begins to produce a new type of person, someone who no longer lives according to dreams, but according to risk ratios. And outsiders often find something very strange. English is still spoken in the language of stability, but the entry requirements to live here are like a toll gate: security deposits, credit checks, rental competition, and a series of upfront costs make many newcomers feel like they're not entering a country, they're entering a contract. So, what exactly is rent buying? A roof, or a ticket to a game whose rules have long changed? And when home becomes the biggest source of stress in life, what will be the first thing to be sacrificed? Sleep, meals, or health? If you want to understand the NHS today, don't start with hospitals. Let's start with the schedule of an ordinary person. A doctor's appointment is no longer just going for a checkup. It's a chain of operations, calling at the right time, waiting for the right music, saying the right keywords, hoping the right person answers. You are not seeking medical services. You are requesting a spot in the system. And perhaps that's why many people are starting to talk about health using the language of luck. I'm lucky I got an appointment. I'm lucky they called back. I'm lucky it's not too late. In a few years, the waiting list for treatment has ballooned from approximately 4.57 million at the beginning of 2020 to around 31 million by the end of 2025, representing approximately 6.17 million individual patients. The median wait time for planned treatment increased from approximately 7.7 weeks before the pandemic to approximately 12.9 weeks. These numbers are not just data. It's the living calendar of millions of families. A few more weeks of waiting means a few more weeks of pain. A few more weeks of being out of work. A few more weeks of living in a state of half human, half bill. But if you just say, wait, you'll miss something more subtle. The NHS doesn't just make people wait longer, it makes people manage their illness themselves for longer. And this is what distorts life. You start self-classifying symptoms as a screening employee. How much pain is considered too much? How much bleeding is considered an emergency? How many nights of sleep deprivation does it take for the body to be allowed to get serious? You're not just worried about the illness. You're even worried about whether your disease qualifies for timely treatment. A civilized society often measures healthcare by the quality of treatment. A weary society began to measure healthcare with a simpler question. Can I see a doctor? Sounds rough, but life is like that. Rough. The NHS affects more than just health. It brought about a very down-to-earth impact on household economies. A person with back pain waiting for treatment means a person with reduced working hours. Reducing working hours means losing money. Being short on money means skipping meals, reducing heating, and postponing repairs. And so, life for the British has come full circle. The high cost of living makes illness more expensive, while waiting for treatment impoverishes them faster. A form of domino where you can't avoid it through personal effort, because you're locked in the same room with the pieces. Of course, someone will say, I'm still being treated. I'm fine. Yes, and it must be said, the NHS still saves a lot of people every day. But precisely because it was once a support system, the sense of loss is even greater when it becomes overloaded for an extended period. It's not like the service is getting worse. It's like a common moral foundation is eroding. You start to wonder if you still have to wait in line when you're at your weakest. Where does this so-called peace of mind even come from? And when faith in healthcare falters, people will look to policy and politics with a different kind of gaze. Not curious, but demanding. And that's where the final part of the story begins. If you ask, where is the exit? The most uncomfortable answer is probably, the way out isn't just about money. It lies in belief. Because even if the economy cools down at times, if people still feel their tax money is going into a machine that doesn't provide even the most basic kindness food, warmth, shelter, healthcare, then any claims of improving will sound like self-reassurance. We also cannot ignore something that erodes trust faster than any indicator. Incidents that give the feeling of directly impacting rights and justice. When an event spanning decades, such as infected blood, reaches the stage of recognition and compensation. It's not just a medical matter, it's an ethical question. Why did it take so many years for the system to say a proper apology when the Post Office Horizon scandal was exposed? Something even more terrifying than a technical error was revealed. A system that could crush individuals through procedure and excessive confidence in machines. In other words, political barriers are not just about a lack of budget, it's distrust. Without trust, even if you spend more, people will still ask, will it actually reach the right place after spending more? But there's still a way out. It's just not a button you can press. On the floor closest to the public, what can reduce friction is transparency. Clearer unit pricing, limiting conditional discounts that make vulnerable people pay more, and protecting consumers from information traps in packaging and marketing. At the system level, what people need is not slogans, but capacity. Healthcare and social services capable of absorbing demand, housing supply sufficient to make prices less punitive, food and energy supply chains less fragile so that people don't have to live in a state of permanent alert. And at the level of trust, a clear mechanism of accountability is needed. Admit mistakes, make corrections, and compensate quickly not for image, but for dignity. So, where do you think the real way out should begin? With price transparency to reduce the daily blood loss for the people, or with reforming public service capacity to reduce the people's need to queue up to live? And what made you lose faith the fastest in the past few years? A rising bill or a delayed promise? Perhaps the saddest thing isn't that Britain is getting worse in a straight line, but it's the feeling of it getting worse little by little, small enough for you to endure today, and steady enough to exhaust you in the long run. People are still going to work, still queuing, and still laughing in the pub. But deep down, the normal threshold just keeps receding. And when a society begins to treat having enough to eat, enough warmth, enough shelter, and enough medical care as negotiable, The question is no longer about statistics. It lies in dignity. If you live in the UK, you may have seen those frictions creep into every decision. If you look from the outside, you might wonder why a country once called stable is making its citizens calculate even the most basic things. I'm not making an absolute conclusion, as everyone has their own experiences, and some places still function better than others. But cracks that repeat long enough are no longer an accident. It's a model worth looking at directly. If you find this video resonates with your experiences, please like it to help it reach more people. Share it with anyone going through similar feelings. And subscribe if you want me to continue dissecting the subtle but direct changes impacting life in the UK. Please note, this content is intended for social and everyday life analysis based on public sources and common experiences. It is not financial, legal, or medical advice. If you are experiencing serious health or safety difficulties, prioritize seeking appropriate professional support.